As we're working on this Choices in History paper, I want to give you a little guidance on probably the trickiest part of your assignment, which is using your primary sources. This is an extra little thing that we're requiring as part of the Kilgore Social Studies Department for our students, to show us the ability to analyze and use primary sources. So, you have already, hopefully, picked out your topic and started finding your sources. Now, as you do, make sure you have a minimum of 5 sources, and at least, of course you can have more, at least have 3 primary sources. So here's a quick review of what we mean by a primary source. A primary source is an eyewitness that saw the event, in this case a choice in history, taking place, being carried out. It could be someone who was a participant. That could be the person who made the choice, the people who carried out the choice, the people who the choice was carried out upon, the people who were affected by that choice. So any of these could be considered primary sources, their perspective on how they experienced the event or witnessed the event. A primary source could also be a legal document, a court decision, a law that was passed, something that is a document from the decision that was made. But it has to be something of that time period, someone who experienced it, or an original document that was part of it. This is what we mean by primary source. A secondary source is something that's written later by someone who wasn't an eyewitness, who wasn't part of it, usually a historian or a reporter of some sort, has gathered the information from eyewitnesses, from original documents, from primary sources. And they've put together a summary. They've put together a historical book, maybe, that is in some way analyzing this particular event. Now, these secondary sources will be very useful to you as you seek to analyze the event yourself, because you can get other experts' opinions. But the requirement in this paper is that you also include and use 3 primary sources. So be sure you've got both secondary and at least 3 original primary sources. Also be sure you remember in selecting your primary sources that they need to be primary sources in and of themselves. So if you have a court document, a book written by someone who was a participant or an eyewitness, these would be primary sources. If you have a secondary source, that maybe some historian wrote about the event, and they have quotes in there from people who were eyewitnesses, that source is still not going to be a primary source. Now, what the person said in there is primary, and they're quoting it, but what you would want to do, if you want to count it as your primary source, is see who they're quoting in there, then go to that original primary document that they used and quoted, and you use that document and quote it yourself. Use it yourself. You can give them credit for giving you some of the ideas about it as you document your paper, but use that source to count as a primary source so that you can analyze it. So be sure you've got 3 primary sources. Now, in getting full credit for using the primary sources, the way your rubric is set up, pay very close attention to it. It tells you how you'll be graded on every aspect of the grade. And of course, your overall objective is to have a thesis, an opinion that you have that you're going to prove about this decision, whether it was a good decision, a bad decision, successful or not. You'll come up with some thesis and you will prove that. You will analyze it and prove it. But as you are proving your thesis, the 4th point on the rubric is you're going to get full credit for this part of the rubric, you're going to need to analyze and use your primary sources as part of the proof for your thesis. So you're going to use these sources, and you will need to specifically analyze these sources. So what that means is you're not just going to quote them. For instance, if we were talking about Harry Truman, President Truman, making the decision to drop the atomic bomb, which is one of your possible topics. you wouldn't just simply quote a letter from Harry Truman talking about dropping the atomic bomb. You could do that. That would show you've used the primary source, but you wouldn't get the points for analyzing that source. You need to, and very briefly, because it's a short paper, but you need to in some way make mention of who this person is and what their perspective is. The perspective of the person is going to matter a good bit. So when you analyze a document, you can use what we've used before in class, the clues method of analyzing a document. So let's say you've taken a primary source. It could be Harry Truman discussing the atomic bomb in a letter to somebody. It could be a Japanese widow's recollection of how she lost her family in the atomic bomb blast. It could be the experiences in a journal of one of the pilots of the Enola Gay. They would all have different perspectives. So what you're going to do in the clues method is, first of all, as you look at the source, see clues, consider the source. Who's saying it? Is it the president who orders dropping the atomic bomb? Is it someone the bomb was dropped on? Is it someone who had to drop the bomb, carry out the order? Consider who's saying it. And they're going to have a certain perspective, maybe a certain motivation. That Japanese widow is going to have a very different feel about what happened than the president who gave the order. They might have some similarities in their views about it, but there may be some differences, and it will be shaped by who they are and their way of looking at it. So you're going to need to consider that and make mention of that possibly as you use that source in your paper. Make mention of who it is that's saying this, their perspective. All right, the second part of analyzing your source, after C, consider the source. L, the next part of clues, is to lay out the argument. What are they saying? Now, if it's a recollection rather than an article where they have a thesis where they're trying to prove something, it may be a little more difficult to do. They're just telling the story. But still, what are they saying? Are they trying to say this decision was a good decision, it was a bad decision, it was devastating to them, this was the greatest thing that ever happened? How do they feel about whichever decision you're looking at? What is their perspective on it? Look at their argument. Thirdly, consider the source, lay out the argument. The third part of clues, U, is uncover the evidence. What do they say that proves their argument? If they say this decision was a good decision, do they say why? Do they give reasons why they think it was a good decision? And then fourthly, clues, you have the letter E. Evaluate the evidence. Is there reason for making the statement that they have proven by what they've said? Have they proved it? Have they convinced you? That's the main part of it I want you to really consider. So as you look at primary sources, consider who it is that's saying it. Lay out the argument. What are they saying? What's their opinion about this decision? You uncover the evidence. Have they given you any reasons or proof for why they feel that way? And E, evaluate it. Are you convinced by them? Now, you don't have to go into every one of those little details every time you use one of these primary sources. That would get a bit wordy and lengthy. But what you do want to do is, when you use one of these primary sources, make mention of one of these parts of clues to show that you have kind of considered where they're getting this or what they're trying to say. You need to show us that you've evaluated it. And to get full credit for that part of the rubric, you have to do it 3 times in the paper. And that's a bit of a just kind of setting standards that, the hoops you've got to jump through. But that's what the rubric is there for, to help you know which hoops we're going to expect you to jump through to get full credit on this paper. Now remember, the main focus is still making sure you have proved your thesis. This is just one element of it, but it's the trickiest element. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of extra help on understanding what primary sources are and how to analyze and use them in your paper. Please feel free to email me if you have any other questions. I want you to do well on this, so please communicate if you need help. and work hard. Don't wait till the last minute, and good luck.